Hi, I'm Adam and welcome to First Man Photography. Today I'm going to show you an amazingly simple technique that you can use to ramp up the quality of your sunset photography. So, come with me. Before we get into it though, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a domain name, a website, or an online store, then make your next move with Squarespace. So there are two problems when you're shooting sunset photography, particularly when you're shooting directly at the sun. Firstly is the sky is going to be much brighter than the ground below the horizon, so we need to sort of somehow balance out that exposure. And the second problem is flare. When you've got the sun in the image, it very often will create flare. The first problem with the exposure is really quite easy to deal with. You've either got the ND Grads like this one to slide in and reduce the exposure above the horizon line of the sky. And the second one, and probably definitely the cheapest, is bracketing, where you take two or three shots, combine them together and get a nice even exposure across the frame. And that's how I like to do it. Flare, however, is a little bit more difficult. Flare happens when you're shooting directly into the light source. In this case, it will be the sun, but it happens by the light going into the lens, and then all the elements inside the lens create that flare. And there's really sort of two types. There's the very obvious ghosting, where you get those rings of flare, and then there's the worst kind, which it's called veiling flare, where it just kind of fills a big portion of the frame and really reduces the contrast in the image, and we really do not want that in our landscape photographs. So with the flare, you can avoid it by not shooting into the sun or keeping the sun to your side and putting a lens hood on there to block the sun. But sometimes you're going to want your composition straight at the sun, because that's what's going to look best for you. That's going to be the shot you want. Happily, there is still a way we can get around this. I'm going to show you how to do that in 1 minute, but I just want to show you this image that we're going to be working with. Before we have a look at the technique itself, I just want to show you how I captured the image.
Okay, so I am set up for my final shot of the day, and this is my composition pretty much, with the viaduct going left to right in the scene, and then I'm hoping to get a lot of beautiful golden light on that viaduct, shining through with some big shadows, and that should look really good. I've got the camera really low down on the floor because I'm on this limestone ledge, and I want the ledge to appear as if it is right in the frame, in the foreground, and then just leads you in straight up to the viaduct without getting all of this sort of rubble and rubbish from this old cave system here. Settings wise, I am at f16 because that stone ledge is right in the foreground on very, very close to the lens. It's still looking sharp at f16, so I'm happy with that. I'm at ISO 100 again, and when you are shooting the sunset, you are always going to have a much brighter sky than you are in the foreground. So balancing the exposure is the challenge with a shot like this. You've either got bracketing or you've got ND Grads. I use bracketing because it's easier. I usually do 2 stops either side. That's what I'm doing here, and it's going to be a really nice scene.
So I mentioned there that I bracketed the shots, but what I didn't show you is how this technique actually works. And all I'm doing when I'm exposing my shot for the foreground, I simply put my finger in front of the lens to block the sun out of the image. We then put it into Lightroom and Photoshop and use masks to remove your finger and combine it all. It's not cheating because your eyes have that amount of dynamic range. The camera doesn't at the moment. So we need to use these little tricks to really tell the story and produce the image that you visualized at the time. Right, let's get into the computer and you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, so we're into Lightroom here, and this one here is the final image. So that's what we're kind of working towards here. And these are the 2 images in this case that I have combined using bracketing. So let's have a look at them. You can see in this image, I have the sun nicely in the image. I have the sort of ghosting flare in the area there. And then look at this horrible large bit of veiling flare that's just putting this horrible big red tinge around a large portion of the image and has just completely ruined it. So that's why we want to remove the flare. So all I've done in the second shot is I've exposed roughly for the foreground here, and then I've put my finger across the sun as little as I possibly can, which is just led in this case to this tiny bit of flare still being there. That's fine though, but the flare down here has now gone. So I'm going to combine those two images. And the way I've done it, I've already edited these two images just a bit to affect the raw files. So with this one, I'm just editing it for the sky here, which I've already done. You can see some of the changes I've made there. And then the second one, I have edited it for the foreground here. So once you've done that and just made this sort of few changes just to balance the exposure, increase a bit of contrast, that sort of thing, we can then combine them in Photoshop. It's just a case of selecting both images, right-clicking, and then go to editing and come down to open as layers in Photoshop. So we're going to click that and then move into Photoshop. Right, into Photoshop, and you can see how those two images have loaded into the layers panel down here. First thing we want to do is just switch those round so you've got the finger at the top here. And then all we're going to do is to use masks to mask out my finger and leave the sun there with that nice starburst and keep all of the flare out the shot. So you can see here, there's no flare in my foreground, and this is going to be the layer that I want to do the mask on to remove the finger. So just come down here, click the mask button, and then you've got various ways that you can affect the mask, but you're basically painting into the mask either black or white. So just click D to reset your brushes, and then you want to paint black into the mask. So press X to switch them around, and then press brush to bring up your brush, which is what we're going to use firstly. And then when we start painting, you can just see that layer underneath start to come through. That then appears on the mask down here as we paint the black into the mask, and you can see quite quickly the finger starts to disappear. This image is quite nice for it because it's got this bridge to separate the foreground and the sky as well. So that's going to work quite nicely. And you can just spread that sun out a bit, and you can see the star trails start to come back. I think I've gone a little bit too far there, so I just want to remove them a little bit just to make it a bit smaller. And we're using this nice big brush so you get this sort of gradient from the soft edge to that brush. You can see up here, choose the hardness of the brush. I've got the hardness down to 0, so you've got that nice soft edge to make those nice smooth edits. I'm going to just undo that a bit more. And then we want to get rid of this bit of ghosting flare here, which just appeared in the image on both images just because I didn't have my finger close enough to the lens. So the way we're going to deal with that is just by hitting the S key to bring up our clone stamp, create a new layer, so we're doing it all non-destructively, and then just very quickly and without much thought, just clone that out so it kind of looks a little bit realistic. Not too bad. I would normally take a bit more time over that. So another way you can do it is just to use the gradient. So again, got your two images here, your finger and your sky. So we want to remove the finger again. This is a bit of a different image without that bridge to separate us. So I'm going to use a gradient this time. So same thing, onto the top layer with the finger and create a mask. And then I'm going to come over to the gradient tool here. Then all we need to do is to draw our gradient in. So come up to roughly where the finger is and then just drag down to the bottom of the image. And that will put the gradient on and instantly remove the finger. And you can see here how the mask has looked. You can then brush it to just make sure that it's all right or make some changes. You can see the foreground going a bit darker there. I'm going to undo that and switch my brush around, and you can start to paint the finger back in. So you've got the two tools to use there. You can then use the luminosity masking to affect each individual bit of tone. In this case, I've now got the highlights selected. Come back to the layers, create a curves layer, and then you can use your luminosity masking on there to adjust the highlights. There's lots more features with luminosity masking that we're not going to go through today. So let's go back to the original image. So now that's looking something like the final image. I'm going to save it and go back into Lightroom for some final touches. So then we come back into Lightroom and we can just finish our edit off in Lightroom. And what I'm going to do is just crop this down a bit because I've got a bit of softness in the foreground here because I was very close to those rocks. So I'm just going to crop out that bit there, and then we can just finish off with a few extra changes to the color and increase saturation, that kind of thing, to bring it back to somewhere near what I saw on the day. When you do have the sun in your image like this as well, just make sure that you're not overexposing it. You can do that by clicking on the whites or the highlights and just bring that down so you're not overexposing that sun, because if it is slightly overexposed when you print it, the printer very well may not put anything on there, so you'll just be left with a small area of blank paper which doesn't look good in your print. But that's it. Very simple, very straightforward. Finger in front of the sun when you're shooting your bracketed shots, when you're exposing for the foreground, put your finger in, remove the sun from the image, and then a bit of masking in Photoshop and Lightroom to remove it. Please leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of the technique. Have you tried it before? I'd love to hear from you. Also, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. I'd like to say a big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring me up to now. But if you go to squarespace.com, you can start your free trial today. And if you go to squarespace.com/firstman, you can get 10% off your first purchase. It really is worth checking out. I'll put more detail about everything we've talked about today down in the description, including that link to Squarespace, and you can check that out of your own accord. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you on another one very, very soon. I'm Adam. This is First Man Photography. Out.